So official.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Reimagined, a Hidden Compass YouTube series. As you know, I'm your host, Lauren Eckert, and I am super thrilled to be joined today by my dear friend, awesome scientist and colleague, Justine Ammendolia. Justine, I do this every time. Did I say your last name correctly?
You got it hands on. Lauren, it's all good. I've heard so many different renditions of it. It's amazing.
Fantastic. Well, Justine is a queer environmental scientist and science communicator based in
Toronto at the moment.
Yeah, okay. I thought still Toronto, but I wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
She holds
to be Halifax.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to make sure I wasn't making that up. She holds a Bachelor of Science from the University of Guelph and a Master's from Memorial University of Newfoundland.
Newfoundland, and then if you're like extra American, you can go Newfoundland.
That's what just happened. My brain. I think folks watching know I'm lived in America until I was 22. I finished my undergrad, and I've been in Canada since for about 8 years. And so I will stumble upon words that I'm like, no, as I say the American version of it, I'm like, no. Anyway, Newfoundland. Justine is also a National Geographic explorer, and she co-developed here's another word, Placentia, not placenta. Placenta Bay Ocean Debris Survey, which is a research program that fosters citizen science in collaboration with rural communities to better understand sources of marine plastics. Welcome, Justine. I made it through those words that were surprisingly hard for me to pronounce.
The most entertaining introduction of all time. I loved it. It was super
unintentional, but I'm glad.
All good.
It's 4 p.m. on a Friday for me, so that may explain some of my brain's increasing inability to focus on pronunciation. So Justine, as you know now, and as folks who watch this series will know, in Reimagined, we're interested in 3 overarching themes. So reconsidering commonly used words with heavy histories, reimagining or imagining new worlds arising at the interface of others, and escaping our individual and collective comfort zones towards better science, storytelling, journalism, and being. And all of these topics, I'm sure we could talk about forever, but today I sort of want to focus on the escaping comfort zones piece of the puzzle with a little sprinkling of imagining new worlds, because I think you do a lot of all of those things. Before we dive in, can you tell me a little bit about Placenta?
Yeah.
Placenta. Okay, it sounds too much like placenta now, so I'm worried about it.
It's a trip up. Oh my gosh, there's so many Newfoundland towns with just like the most creative names.
So I was, this is an aside, but I was once at dinner with someone who saw polenta on a menu and asked how the placenta was. And so I have like a deep fear and aversion to any words that look like placenta, because I'm worried I'll say placenta instead of word. So tell us a little more about the Placenta Bay Ocean Debris Survey.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, so yeah, that project was phenomenal. That was really like just introduced myself with regards to my research. I'm really interested in trash, and I'm one of those weird people that instead of when you're going out for walks and you're supposed to be looking at the scenery, I usually just look down and it's trying to see like what kind of wrappers are there and how much trash you see on the side of the sidewalk, and we're trying to figure out basically where it's coming from. So that's really where my interests with research lie, is looking at that interface of human activity and how it results to contamination and pollution through plastics in the environment. So, that keeping that in mind with that trash aspect about myself, and the rest will totally make way more sense. Basically, with that project, I was living out in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador for about 5 years. I did my master's out in this eastern province of Canada. And if you're not familiar, it's basically the furthest east you can get in North America is at the point of Cape Spirit on this island. And it's a beautiful island, Newfoundland. I mean, there's 500,000 people there. And, it's just, I think, a little under the size of California. So we're dealing with like this really big space and a lot of wildlife out there. So during my time there, after I finished my master's, I really dove deep into the world of trash on coastal settings. And one of my first projects outside of my graduate degree was basically becoming a research assistant with an amazing group out there. And, the professor that employed me had about two other women at the time. And basically he gave us a budget to work with and said, figure out a research project that can be done all year long out in the middle of like rural Newfoundland, and yeah, just basically have fun studying trash. So it was essentially a dream job for someone coming out of their grad degree. And it was just, kind of getting thrown into this whole world of logistical problem solving, from like figuring out how you rent a vehicle, from 3 a.m. in the morning to go out, at the best tide schedule, to go and climb these beaches, and figuring out, from Google Maps, and really kind of identifying like satellite imagery to get out to these off the grid kind of beaches, because in Newfoundland, like I mentioned, there's not too many folks, especially when we're dealing with rural communities. It's just, you get out to these towns of 100 people, 30 people in some cases, and you kind of become really engaged with the community pretty quickly. So that whole project revolved around going out to beaches around this beautiful bay, which was Placenta Bay, and just trying to figure out, what kind of garbage was there and where was it coming from, and also having this really cool aspect of community engagement. Whether that be, doing community beach cleanups where we would have the students come and join us, or community members, having teaching sessions on how to basically do our job, which was essentially using citizen science, and trying to use the most accessible forms of science so that no one got really left out of the fun work that we were doing, picking up 60,000 pieces of debris over the course of 2 years. Yeah. So it was a really interesting project just because of, there's so many different questions you can come out with trash, and just even looking at a piece of debris, it gave me a whole new appreciation for it's like sources, fates, and transport. I mean, it's almost similar to people in a lot of ways. It's like there's a long life history for garbage. So
what a fascinating and cool project. I have to say, after my summer of field work, I so appreciate, but I think it's often underappreciated in sciences, the really challenging logistical elements of developing a project like you just described, that like most people don't think about, because they're such basic aspects of the work, like figuring out how you're going to drive or transport yourself and your materials somewhere, like on what schedule, how you're going to triangulate with communities. It's a huge undertaking, and it requires the use of like so many different skills and parts of your brain. So well done. That's super, super neat. And the citizen science aspect of that is somewhere that really excites me. But I also think, speaking to our theme, is outside of a lot of scientists' comfort zone, because we're rigidly trained in these institutions. And then we often have the really exciting, but also scary work of handing over our rigid rules about how to do things, trusting communities to handle that. Can you tell me a little bit about the citizen science aspect of that project?
Yeah, for sure. And I can even dive into some of, I guess, the more, bigger scopes regarding citizen science and some of the problems that arises with these methods. But basically, citizen science is really, at its bare basics, is getting a group of people, who are not necessarily specialists or biologists, being engaged in doing science and asking very real questions and finding real world observations and collecting data in order to kind of tackle these broader problems that we're facing in the world, or even just kind of keeping a good field notebook of what's happening around them. So citizen science is a relatively new concept in terms of like the terminology itself, but within the past say 15 years, especially with mobile app technologies, we've just seen this explosion of different ways that communities and folks who are outside the sciences can get involved with doing science. And that's all the way from tracking monarch butterflies as they do their migrations from Mexico all the way up to Canada, in that people can make observations and snap pictures of them, all the way through iNaturalist, which is another great app that monitors biodiversity. And you can take a picture of an animal, and like this whole community will literally flock at these pictures, and just like everyone bombarding it.
It's my favorite. It's so nerdy and so wonderful. It's like Pokedex, Pokemon index
totally.
for actual animals. I guess you could say Pokemon is like Wow.
Oh man.
But
Any
I
millennial like that hears that,
love
it's just
it.
like, I know, I know all they're missing is
That
just
one's
like
for
the
the
little
90s kids.
cartoon. Totally. I know, like literally that's what it boils down to, especially with insects. You're like, oh, this is where they oh my God, all their inspiration. But like, yeah, so like iNaturalist is a great app. And then my favorite, of course, because the whole trash thing, marine debris tracker tends to be my jam. And this app is wonderful. It's open access. So basically anyone can download it around the world and you can use it in any country. And basically it works similar to iNaturalist, but again, not animals garbage, where you can basically snap a shot of the garbage that you're seeing. When you pick it up, you can mark it down on this app. And basically it creates a pin on like all the information associated with this, its location, time of collection, what kind of garbage it is. And it gets submitted to a database that I think right now is over like 3 million pieces of trash and growing very quickly actually over the pandemic. But what's great is that, you know, like when we're dealing with problems like plastic pollution, it's one of those issues that isn't going to be solved by one person or one organization or, you know, even a company for that matter. It's going to take the cooperation of millions of people around the world trying to find out where this trash is coming from and how we can kind of, you know, block it off at the pathways. So that's really citizen science has amazing application. But yeah, huge fan. And in terms of what you were saying with like a lot of scientists, sometimes there's reluctancy to, you know, open up the gates and you know, give people methods, for example.
Totally.
I don't know, Lauren, you must have encountered it at some point.
Oh yeah.
The secrecy behind doing
Yeah.
science. Yeah.
The like ivory towering of, you know, there are a lot of scientific methods. Now, obviously, there is a real importance to rigor and deep understanding and degrees that can help you be a good scientist, but also the fundamentals of question asking based on observation, hypothesis, and data collection should be democratized, should be available to everyone. It's sort of one of like, I think the really neat fundamental aspects of science is that it's a process that should be available to everyone, whether you can, you know, manage to end up in a 4-year or longer program or not. And so, yeah, I understand the need for rigor, of course, but also I think sometimes there's unnecessary hesitation around this idea that like everyone can engage across ages, across populations, across locations, across technologies and science. Yeah, especially now that we all have smartphones in our pockets with incredible capacity. I know there are really cool stories that have come out of iNaturalist where someone will snap a photo of like an animal running across their porch, and many scientists who sort of lurk on the app will realize it's an animal. Like I'm gonna forget the species that this was, and maybe I can find it and link it in the show notes. But there have been a number of species that have been like rediscovered, or rather, scientists have realized they're not extinct as they believed they were because of observations via iNaturalist. So whether animals or plastic, there's a massive contribution there, and it's really, really, really cool stuff. Really exciting.
For sure. And even within the scope of like, and I love that example that you pulled up because it just shows that, you know, you don't need degrees to make valid observations.
Totally.
I mean, it's just like, yeah, the way we push science with kids where it's like, go to school and get that education and learn how to like develop a hypothesis when, you know, like people are doing this, making theories and, you know, making suggestions of what they think the world would look like and, you know, what drives it. And I mean, it's inherent, I think, to human nature in so many ways. But one really interesting thing that you pointed out was, you know, just the widespread nature of citizen science. And I think during the pandemic specifically, you know, this is kind of just become so much more apparent to the scientific community that, you know, we can't do science the way we've been doing it for centuries, where you take a specifically are very like kind of specialized group of trained people, send them to a different country, collect data, and then leave. Versus, you know, having people on the ground doing it themselves in their own communities, which is what like is so great about citizen science, and that it kind of opens up those barriers and gives tools and yeah, really means to collect that information.
Awesome. Wonderful point. I totally agree. And I think we've been learning that for a while as a scientific community, and the wave sort of crested with the pandemic. I wonder too, while we're talking about the pandemic, if you can speak to, I really like this framing. You sort of mentioned plastics as obviously like reflecting of human, but it's like kind of a framing for the human story. I remember learning, I think it was in a geography course, about different philosophies about if, aliens visit our planet in
Mm,
300,000 years, what in the fossil record will indicate our presence best. And it is, in fact, plastic, this
mm,
layer of plastic that would exist in the fossil record that
mm.
would signal our presence. So it's a very potent storyteller about humans, potentially not a very good one in terms of values, depending what your values are. But could you tell me a little bit about your observations of the story of plastics throughout the pandemic? Like, has our use increased? Go
Mm.
for it.
That's such a great question. And I love the whole, like, what plastics, well, like, what would we find in the fossil record? And instantly my mind went to like blue face masks. I mean,
Right? Totally.
I feel like there would be this blurb in human history of like
Yeah.
plastic development, where it's just like what plastics characterize our existence in different periods. It's
Yeah.
funny actually, like, I mean, plastics haven't been a stranger to humanity. I mean, people started using them hundreds of years ago, mostly indigenous communities in South America with the
Mm-hmm.
rubber tree, right?
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
syrup that would come out was natural based rubber. And, that didn't really, it wasn't like it was mass produced, not like
Yeah.
plantation
Yeah.
rubber trees, kind of polluting the planet. But, following that in the early 1900s, we start to see the emergence of bakelite, a very kind of primary elementary form of plastics. And then by the
Mm,
1950s, post World Wars, it's just this explosion of
totally.
consumption. And I mean, even Life, the magazine, at one point coined it like the age, or the throwaway age of living,
Wow.
where, it was totally socially acceptable to eat your dinner and throw your plate out in the garbage. And
Oh,
it was like revolutionary, where it's like, you don't have to wash dishes anymore. You're free of that. Everything could just be like thrown out. And I mean, most of us right now probably cringe at the
yeah.
idea of like what sustainability looks
Yeah.
like. But plastics,
Cortisol coursing
yeah,
through me. Yeah.
for sure. And like, I mean, the terms plastic in themselves, it's just such a broad umbrella term. Like,
Yeah.
what is plastic anyways? Because I
Yeah.
mean, most of us probably have different images that come to mind.
Totally.
And that's where I think that it's such an interesting material, because you can look at different points in human history, and there's been
Mm-hmm.
different types of plastics, either the material or, whatever items they're formed into, that kind of define us. And yeah, like humans, they're always changing, always evolving. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a very you dove off the deep end on that
Yeah. Oh, I
one.
love it. That's what we're here
Yes.
for. And
Yeah.
it is.
Mm,
I'm spiraling a little bit in a good
mm,
and bad way, just thinking about, even though I'm aware of like some of the
mm,
diversity of plastics, I'm by no means particularly educated in that arena. But
mm,
findings about microplastics really
mhm,
change what our interpretation of plastic in our environment is. Invisible plastics in our Gore-Tex jackets, these things that like I certainly don't automatically bin as
mhm,
plastic technologies that are plastic technologies.
for sure.
So that's fascinating. It was a great answer.
Mm.
Yeah,
Well,
what
and like
a
the whole
fascinating thing.
and just to kind of jump the gun on your point, I mean, it's just like the idea of microplastics, right? I mean,
Hmm.
smaller than 5 millimeters, or smaller. That's not just the smallest margin. Now we're
Yeah,
diving into the world of nanoplastics, which are like microns large, and like still the field is very elementary. We're just trying to figure out how to assess and measure. But I mean, I think that's when the alarm bells started going off, really, with society, paying attention to this problem, because
totally.
it's not like plastics weren't there growing up in the 90s. I mean, they were
Yeah,
basically at every beach we would visit. I mean, people started seeing plastic debris in the 50s, 60s.
yeah.
But it was just this idea that, wow, plastics have gotten so small that, they can enter our bodies. Should we care?
Wild.
Should we? So
Yeah,
I think it's like that whole, are we, this new relationship and this new engagement with plastics in a very different and unknown way, I think what's kind of captured a lot of people's imaginations,
yeah.
and for a lot of scientists to kind of, yeah, dive into this world.
I
But
feel like we could go so many different directions. I have
yeah.
just millions of questions to ask you right now.
Yeah.
One thing I'm wondering about is, I think plastics and plastic pollution can be
Mm,
really daunting and scary for a lot of
mhm,
people. And certainly there have been a number of improvements in awareness. I tend to get a
mhm,
little frustrated by large corporations being like, here, buy a longer use plastic bottle from us because otherwise we'll sell you a non recyclable one. How do you, given that you think about plastics all the time and have this
mhm,
like incredible knowledge base and observation base about plastics, balance that data with hope that we won't be a plastic planet in 50 years.
Gotcha. So just to kind of like rewind for a microsecond, you're asking how do I stay hopeful, like studying such a depressing topic?
Totally. A question for all conservationists, I'm sure. But
I think so many of us struggle with that, right? And that's such a profound question. That's actually usually my favorite to ask people.
Right?
I mean, it's like, where can I take notes on that? Because I think
exactly.
Like everyone has this disillusion where it's like, oh, science, you must be hanging out with like lions and cheetahs, and like, oh, you do conservation. So Lauren, you're out in BC, you must be hanging out with bears or collecting their poop. I mean,
mostly look at their poop. Exactly. And a very small amount of the time.
Exactly. I think really boiling it down to small questions helps a lot for me specifically, because if you were to look at the big picture, it's far too daunting. And when you look at, how we tackle problems as a collector, as a world these days, most of it tends to be focused on the individual. There's one saving, climate change activist who's going to change the world and mobilize everyone, versus a collective of people working on the problem. And that's where I try to keep perspective that, like, I just turned 30 this year, maybe I have another good 35 years of my career left ahead of me. And then after that, someone else is going to come. Or, there's other people around the world working on local levels on this problem, and just kind of keeping perspective of what the limitations are as one person. And so anytime I take on problems, I tend to kind of hyper focus in on that problem. And I'm like, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to try to find a solution, I'm going to do justice on this like one particular bit, but also keeping in mind the bigger picture. So one story, if I can, like, to
absolutely, please.
Yeah. So going back to the blue face masks, like during the pandemic, when it was just such a crap time for everyone around the world, with like just being locked up and like not knowing what would happen. And just to build context, I mean, like I just came out of a decent job that had like benefits, and I was just like, I'm going to do my PhD in 2020, and everything just kind of didn't go as planned. And Lauren and I were supposed to give a talk in DC. There was a lot of cool stuff happening, but everything I just figured out. I
almost made it, man. Almost made it.
Barely. The States didn't close their border, but like, just figuring out, how to uncancel all your plans and relearn how to like slow down a bit. I think really put things in perspective. And during this period, I was just like, what kind of project am I going to do? Like, I'm hundreds of miles away from the ocean that I studied, and like had good background to work in. So, being in Toronto, being where I grew up, it was pretty gnarly at first. And, just figuring out how to, go for a walk was a learning step. And during the pandemic, my partner and I did our evening walks, and we started noticing blue face masks, gloves, disinfectant wipes. And it just started, like, it started off as a quick, wow, this is interesting. Like, everyone's wearing them now, they're on the ground. Oh, like, and then we kind of did a double take at each other. And we're like, oh shit, this is gonna be the new problem, isn't it? So like from there, keeping hope, I think it was just using those small little wins of like, okay, wow, we saw something really cool. The next step that we had was like, well, how do we document it? Because we're in a really unique point in history, and we just don't want to sit around and be like, we don't want to be those people on Twitter who post a picture and then move on with their lives. We wanted to kind of like dive in. So then we basically blew up our idea into like a full-blown monitoring project, which we turned evening walks into basically a scientific survey, just
amazing
for fun. And it was so funny because like that little bit, I guess the uncertainty of like, is what I'm doing good enough? Is it something that's going to actually matter? Am I just wasting my time? And always questioning like if there's someone smarter than you out there. That always that sticks, right? So I think with us, Lauren's like,
I know, well, that imposter syndrome,
man, those little voices. And it's so funny because I think the hope thing came in from the fact that like, as we were doing this project in Toronto, monitoring gloves and masks and picking up all the disgusting stuff nobody wanted to touch early 2020, papers on this topic of like the presence of masks and gloves started erupting from Portugal, from Peru, from like Ethiopia. And it was so interesting to see that like, yes, you're on the right path, but you're in your little part of the world, whereas other people are working on it. And like collectively, being able to connect with so many amazing people doing this work just really amplifies the messaging. So and I think,
such a local and global phenomenon. The scales are so linked. That was Such a beautiful answer, Justine.
It's cute. Yeah, sorry. It's a
Oh
little
my God. No, I loved it.
long-winded story.
I loved it. I'm absolutely struck by it's really funny timing. I consume way too much audio knowledge. I consume podcasts constantly, but I just happened to be listening to one in which Dr. Anna Lamke was being interviewed. She's a psychiatrist, I believe, at Stanford and an author. I'll link to some of her work in the show notes, just in case people are interested. But she was talking about dopamine, being a human, all these things. But something she brought up that really, really, really struck me about how to like have a sustainable career in a world that's full of unsustainable things was to look around you and ask what needs to be done. And I really was profoundly affected by that. I think, especially when in the sciences, we're often drawn to like these like individualistic stories, individualistic problem solving, despite the opportunity of collaboration. So that was just such a beautiful answer that like totally echoed what I just heard and been so like moved by. And also, we could talk about this forever. We'll save it for a future episode. But I love that you mentioned the community-oriented aspect of this work, that it's global in its endeavor, even if local in our problem identification. Because I think a lot of storytelling, which will be the last question I ask you about, ends up focusing on individuals. I think that's a really Western thing. And science and life is all about community. So thank you for that really thoughtful answer. That was gorgeous. I love it.
No, and even just looking around and, asking what needs to be done. I think that's what's so we almost hit a void with so many jobs where it's like, no, but we have to stick to the agenda and keep it so rigid and strict. And it's like, yeah, I just feel like this pandemic was a wake up call for so many industries where it's like pivoting, I think, is just so essential to doing good work and passionate work as well.
And paying attention. Yeah, I love that. So for anyone listening, it's obvious now you're a wonderful science communicator. And you're wonderful on social media, on video, and also on stages of organizations like National Geographic Society. Could you just talk briefly? I'm cognizant of time, and this is your Friday night, but what is important about science communication for you, or what makes you excited about science communication?
For sure. I think like I would reflect that question right back. It's like, how do you like, what makes me excited is seeing other people get excited. I would just like twist your words into my answer.
Totally.
Where it's like, yeah, I just always remember growing up and, watching TV shows, reading Nat Geo and like being captivated by images, but also the captions underneath in the stories and being like, wow, that's just so cool. Like anyone can take a picture, but to tell a picture that tells a story and that you can kind of like guide your readers, your audience, and any folks on different media into this like storyline where they become invested and engaged. That always stood out to me quite a bit. And to be honest with you, as a kid, I was the most socially awkward creature alive. Like it was just even being able to tell a story, it was just like, man, how do you tell an engaging story?
Really?
Yeah, totally. Oh, I remember I did speech competitions in high school, and like the first year I like face palmed on or
my gosh.
It was
that's brave, man.
My God, that was just like 13-year-old Justine, quite the winner. But like
13-year-old, 13's a hard time.
But like 17, I improved enough, right? I placed second in a speech competition. And I think that for me was just like, whoa, okay. So if you try hard enough, it's not just, stories they tell you where it's like, oh yeah, you can really do good. No, it's just like you can improve it step by step. And I think really doing science communication is about that. It's about sticking to your guns. And like sometimes you're never going to give the best presentation, or you're not going to captivate your audience in the way you want to. But it's about taking notes, kind of going back to the drawing board and listening to other voices and really kind of honing in what you like and what you enjoy and developing your own style. At the end of the day, there's so many different stories floating out there. And like, I think it's just the magic of like, how do you tell your story in a really unique and captivating way where it's like, if one person can enjoy your talk, like you've made it, that's it. You don't have you don't have to talk to an audience full of 500 people. If you can get one person to resonate with you, I think that's a win and a half.
Totally.
So,
Oh, I relate deeply to that. As
mhm.
we've talked about many a time, much of my trajectory was set by exposure to stories mainly about wildlife, but that sort of captivated me at an early age about science, about that wildlife. And like, obviously, I'm one person, but for me, that is the whole world, that directionality that was first fostered by science storytelling. So thank you. A really awesome answer. Where can folks find you online or
on the
elsewhere?
social media world?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want them to.
Right on. I'm developing my website, so that's like
Good for
5
you.
years overdue. Oh my gosh, yeah. No, I
It
was
always
waiting until I
is.
had it. I just started my
Story of my
PhD.
life.
I was telling you before, I started my PhD at Dell. So like, yeah, now that I have a home for like 3+ years where I'm not changing
Plus.
contract after contract,
Yeah.
that's coming soon. But like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the normal ones. I haven't
Awesome.
dove into TikTok yet. That feels like a generation gap. So
I know. It's a lot to ask.
I'll do that for cooking, but
I will hyperlink all of those below so people can find out more about your work and your storytelling and all of the things. Thank you so much. It has been way too long, and this has been so wonderful. It was a salve I needed today. Thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you a million, Lauren, for having me. This has been fantastic. Happy to
I'll
talk
have to have
trash
you back
anytime.
again.
I know. Oh my
That's
gosh.
way too much fun.
Hopefully in person one of these days.
God,
We'll
please.
try to amp up the
Yeah.
the hosting skills
Amazing.
there.
Well, thank you, Justine.
All right.